Hello Flight Simmers and welcome back to Alpha Hotel Flight Simulator Training. This is video 5 in our series on RNAV-GPS approaches. In this video we'll discuss how to fly an RNAV-GPS approach that has no vertical guidance, where you need to decide how to descend on the final approach segment. We'll take a look at how these approaches work, how to fly them, and then we'll go demonstrate flying one in the GNS 530 equipped analog Cessna 172 Classic. Before you begin this video, it's a good idea to be familiar with the basics of instrument flying, as well as the basics of flying instrument approaches. You'll also want to be familiar with the basics of how to operate the Garmin GNS 530 or 430. You'll also want to be familiar with the basics of how RNAV GPS approaches, which we covered in video 1 of this series. And you should also be familiar with the basics of descending on instrument approaches that don't have vertical guidance. It's also not a bad idea to be proficient at localizer approaches, as these approaches are flown in a very similar manner to those approaches. As usual, I'll leave a link to all these videos and playlists in this video's description. So what are RNAV GPS approaches without vertical guidance? How do you fly them, and why would you want to? As we've discussed in previous lessons, RNAV approaches can be designed to have approved vertical guidance, as with LPV or LNAV-VNAV approaches. These approaches are flown much like an ILS, following the lateral and vertical guidance from the GPS down to a decision altitude or DA. Some approaches, like LP and LNAV approaches, won't have approved vertical guidance, but our GPS receivers will provide an advisory glide path we can fly. When you have this, it creates the LNAV plus V and the LP plus V type approaches. The technique used to fly these approaches is very similar to the way we fly the approaches with approved vertical guidance, but there are a few key differences. We talked about how to fly these approaches in video 4 of this series. Sometimes, however, the receiver we're using or the approach we're flying will not have any kind of vertical guidance we can follow. This can happen with both LP and LNAV approaches. When this happens, we have to fly the approach much like a localizer approach. The lateral course guidance will get us to the runway threshold, but we're on our own as far as how we descend to our minimums. Like other non-precision approaches, these approaches use a minimum descent altitude or MDA for minimums. When GPS approaches first came into widespread use in the early 2000s, the only type of approaches that were available were LNAV approaches, then just designated GPS approaches, and neither the approaches nor the receivers had or provided any sort of vertical guidance. In Flight Simulator, almost every GPS available in the sim has the capability of producing advisory vertical guidance on most approaches. So to fly these older style GPS approaches without vertical guidance, we actually have to disable the SBAS capability of the receiver, which you can only do on the Garmin GNS 530 and 430. To demonstrate how to fly one of these approaches, we'll use the analog Cessna 172 Classic available in the deluxe edition of the sim, which is equipped with the GNS 530 and 430. We'll use it to fly a short IFR flight between Pine Bluff Airport in Pine Bluff, Arkansas. The identifier on that airport is Kilo Bravo Papa Foxtrot, to Stuttgart Airport in Stuttgart, Arkansas, which is an identifier of Kilo Sierra Golf Tango, where we'll fly the RNAV GPS approach to runway 9 using the LNAV minimums. We'll turn off the WAS or SBAS capability of the GPS so we receive no vertical guidance on the approach. After departing Pine Bluff, we'll navigate direct to Riddock intersection or Riddock waypoint, which is one of the initial approach fixes for this approach, and then proceed in on the approach from there. Our filed route will be Pine Bluff Airport, direct Riddock intersection, direct Stuttgart Airport, though in real life you could probably just file between the two airports and let ATC know that you plan to start the approach at Riddock once airborne. We'll file for an altitude of 3,000 feet, which is above the off-route obstruction clearance altitude for this area and the minimum safe altitude on the approach. The flight is just over 38 track miles and should take about 25 minutes to fly in the Cessna 172. We'll plan to depart runway 36 at Pine Bluff. We've checked the takeoff and departure procedures for the airport. There are takeoff obstacle notes, but no obstacle departure procedures, so we can just use the standard diverse departure procedure of climbing on runway heading to 400 feet AGL before executing a turn on course. We'll assume that the weather at Pine Bluff is good enough that we can get back in and that we feel comfortable departing. Current weather at Stuttgart is reported as calm winds, 1 statute mile visibility in mist, overcast ceiling of 400 feet, temperature 15, dew point 15, and an altimeter standard at 2992. We'll assume that we filed an alternate for the flight and that it is a legal alternate. So let's take a broad overview of the approach here and do a briefing on the approach plates, and then we'll get into the specifics of how to fly this type of approach. We'll start at the top left of the plate like we always do. We confirm that this is indeed Stuttgart, Arkansas that we are going into, and that is the RNAV-GPS approach to runway 9 into Stuttgart Municipal Carl Humphrey Field. The FAA identifier is going to be Sierra Golf Tango. The ICAO identifier will stick a K on the beginning of that, and that is Kilo Sierra Golf Tango. That is what we will put in our GPS. It tells us that this is an RNP approach, GPS approach, and we know that our GNS 530 is certified for RNP approaches, so we're good to go there. The T tells us that there's something non-standard about departing here, IFR. So if we want to get back out of here under IFR, then we'll need to take a look at the TERPs and see what is going on there. And then it tells us that it has non-standard alternate minimums. So to use this airport as an alternate, something is different there. So we would need to look that up as well, but not really applicable to us as an arrival. Does have some notes about if we do not get the local altimeter setting, we need to use Little Rock's airport, and we increase MDAs for certain categories of aircraft, and we also increase visibilities. And then it says that the VDP, or the visual descent point, is not authorized or not available when we use the Little Rock altimeter settings. None of that applies to us. We will be using the local Stuttgart altimeter, so none of that is applicable to us. It details the missed approach procedure. It tells us in the event of a missed approach, we'll climb to 2000 directly ahead and then go direct to WEGAV waypoint and hold. And you can see that's depicted here on the plan view. Here's our straight out, and then here is our missed approach hold down in this little offset box down here. Under that, it gives us all the frequencies that we'll need. It has the weather reporting station here that we could listen into. It has approach and departure control, the clearance delivery frequency we can use to close our flight plan on the ground, and then the Unicom/common traffic advisory frequency we'll use once we're handed off from approach to make traffic calls to the local traffic in the area. Looking at the plan view, we can see that we have a minimum safe altitude on this approach. It is based on runway 9, the waypoint at runway 9, which is in our GPS when we load up the approach. And when we're within 25 nautical miles of that waypoint, we are safe to go down to 2,500 feet and still have adequate obstacle clearance. Again, an MSA is not a procedure altitude, so in the real world, you cannot descend down to 2,500 feet when you're within 25 nautical miles of this fix. You do need clearance from ATC, but in Flight Simulator, this is helpful to know how low I can go when I'm within that distance and still have my minimum obstacle clearance. We do have the areas of water depicted, a river up here and a couple of lakes that are around and about. We also have obstacles. You'll notice there are a few obstacles that are close to the approach course here, one just to the north at 497 feet MSL, and one just north of the course at 334 feet plus or minus. So those are obstacles that we need to be aware of and make sure that we don't go underneath our minimums lest we compromise our obstacle clearance, and then be looking for them when we break out. And then the tallest obstacle is the biggest symbol. It's down here to the southeast of the airport at 728 feet MSL, but as well to the southeast, so it should not be a factor for us. You'll notice that there are a number of feeder routes that come in from Taft Intersection, Little Rock VOR, and Pine Bluff VOR. We will not be using any of those. We will be taking off from Pine Bluff and then navigating direct to the Red Oak intersection, which you can do with a GPS. It also has some notes on the feeder routes there to tell you that they're not available from certain directions coming in on certain radials or certain airways. Looking at the general overall design of the approach, we do have a initial approach fix slash intermediate approach fix with a procedure turn here if we're coming in from this area of the approach. If we are coming in from this direction, we can use the initial approach fix of PMA. And then we are going to be coming in from this direction down here, so we can go direct to RIDOC and navigate in on the approach from there. We'll look at the specific segments here that we're going to fly here in just a little bit. First, let's take a look at the profile view. You can see here it has the holding pattern depicted, which we are not going to use, but prior to reaching Hinox, you can go down to an altitude of 2,000 feet. Once you cross Hinox intersection, which will be on the GPS, you can descend down to 1,900 feet. And then our final approach fix, where we start our descent from that 1,900 feet down to our MDA, or in this case, we're going to use a DDA, or Derived Decision Altitude, is Geese intersection. And that's where we will, once we cross that fix, we will start our descent towards the runway on the final approach segment. It does tell you that if you calculate a descent path, the optimal descent path for this approach is going to be 3.05 degrees. We will use that to calculate our targeted descent rate and use it to calculate our cross-check points. And we'll talk all about all of that here in just a little bit. And then it tells us that the threshold crossing height, if we are on that descent path, is going to be 45 feet. So we will be 45 feet above the runway threshold if we are able to stay on this calculated descent path all the way to the runway. It does have a visual descent point. Visual descent point tells us that at this point, this is where we should arrive at our MDA if we stay on that calculated glide path, and at that point we should be able to pick up the runway and continue a descent. We can, if we need to, if we don't pick up the runway, continue forward at our MDA, and again in our case, the DDA. We can continue forward to the missed approach point, but once we have passed that missed approach, or once we have passed that visual descent point, we may not be able to make a safe normal descent to the runway. We may be too high. So be aware that if you get past 1 nautical mile from the runway on your GPS and you don't have the runway in sight, even if you get it in sight at that point, you may be too high to descend for a normal landing. It does tell us that the runway 9 is the missed approach waypoint on this approach, and then it gives us the distances between each of these points down here and depicts the runway down here. It does have just LNAV MDA and LNAV minimums. It is a minimum descent altitude, and it is the same for the straight-in approach for categories A, B, and C aircraft. And then they changed the visibility a little bit for category D aircraft or category A aircraft. So this is the box you want to pay attention to here. It tells us that the minimum descent altitude is 600 feet, that the minimum required visibility is 1 nautical mile to shoot this approach or land from the approach. And then it tells us that the 600 feet on our altimeter is going to be 378 feet above the touchdown zone if we level off at that MDA. And then, of course, the ones in the box are just for the military, not applicable to us as civilian users. Other information that's on the chart does have the circling minimums here. That is not applicable to us. We will not be using a circling approach. It does reiterate that the airport elevation is 224 feet. The touchdown zone is 222 feet, shows us where the approach course comes in from. It is pretty much straight in lined up with the runway. It gives us the runway dimensions here. Our runway is 5,002 feet long by 150 feet wide, so a nice size runway for our 172. And then it gives us the dimensions of the other runway as well. Shows us that we have a beacon up here at 279 feet is how tall that beacon is. And then it shows us that we do have approach lighting for runway 36, but we do not have any sort of approach lighting for runway 9. Also tells us that the runway lighting is medium intensity runway lighting for runways 18, 36, and runway 927. In the real world, it is pilot-controlled lighting. That's what that black L tells us. But in Flight Sim, it is always on. Always also tells us that there are runway end identifier lights for runway 18 and 27. That they're also pilot-controlled in the real world. I don't think those are actually installed in Flight Simulator. They're not there. But that doesn't really matter to us because runway 9 does not have those anyway. All right, so let's talk through how we're actually going to fly this approach. So again, we're going to take off from Pine Bluff and we're going to navigate direct to Riddock, which is the initial approach fix. We're going to climb to 3,000. We'll assume that when we get within 10 nautical miles of Riddock or so, air traffic control is going to give us a descent clearance down to 2,500 feet. We should be within about 25 nautical miles of the runway 9 waypoint at that point, so it will be safe for us to go down to 2,500 feet and that will clear us for the approach. So we'll descend to 2,500 feet. Once we hit Riddock, then we can go ahead and proceed on from Riddock into Hinox, and that will be loaded in the GPS. And then we can, since we are cleared for the approach, descend down to 2,000 feet. That is the segment or the procedure altitude for this segment. It says no PT, so we don't have to worry about doing this holding pattern in lieu of procedure turn at Hinox. We'll just proceed straight in on the approach. It tells us that the course is 360 and that this segment is 5 nautical miles. Tells us that Hinox is the intermediate approach fix as well as being an initial approach fix. For us, it serves as an intermediate fix. So once we hit Hinox, it will turn onto the intermediate segment to Geese intersection. And so it will sequence from Hinox to Geese. At that point, our procedure altitude is 1,900 feet. Again, we've been cleared for the approach. We can go ahead and descend from 2,000 down to 1,900 feet at this point. Approach course is 090 degrees, and this segment is 6 nautical miles long. Once we get about 3 nautical miles from Geese, we'll go ahead and configure for our descent. So we'll get the airplane configured and on the approach speed. And then as we hit Geese, you'll see that the GPS will sequence from Geese to runway 9. It will not sequence to the visual descent point. We have to know that is 1 nautical mile from the runway. So that's how we know where that point is. But the GPS will just sequence between Geese and sequence to runway 9. Once it's sequenced, then we'll go ahead and start our descent towards the derived decision altitude, which we'll talk about what that is and how we calculate that here in just a second. And we'll use a targeted descent rate, and we'll talk about how to come up with that here in just a second. We'll descend down to our derived decision altitude, and once we hit that derived decision altitude, we will look up and see if we see the airport, and if we do, we'll continue to a visual landing. If not, we'll go ahead and execute the missed approach. Again, our MDA is 600 feet on our altimeter. That is 600 feet MSL, and we are going to adjust that upwards by 50 feet and make it 650 feet to convert it to the DDA. And so we'll talk about how to do that in just a little bit. Also a reminder that once you hit runway 9, if you do need to go missed approach, it will not sequence automatically. You will have to go down and it will go into suspension mode, and you'll have to go down and hit the OBS button to get it to sequence to the missed approach waypoint. So let's talk a little bit about how we are going to do the vertical descent on this type of approach. There are 2 methods you can use to descend on an approach without vertical guidance: the traditional old school dive and drive method, or the newer continuous descent final approach method. With the dive and drive method, you hit your final approach fix, then descend rapidly to and level at your MDA. You then fly level at the MDA until you get the runway in sight and descend for a visual landing or hit the missed approach point and execute the missed approach. With the CDFA technique, you use a targeted descent rate that you calculate to stay on the descent angle specified for the approach. You use your distance from the runway and your altitude to cross-check that you're staying on this descent angle as you descend. You add 50 feet to the MDA to make it a derived decision altitude, or DDA, and you generally continue to a visual landing if you have the runway in sight, or execute the missed approach if you don't have the runway in sight at this altitude. We'll be using the CDFA technique to fly this approach. To prepare for and fly a continuous descent final approach, or CDFA, there are 5 steps that you need to follow. First, you need to determine the visual descent angle for the approach. This is pretty easy as it's listed on the approach plate. Then you need to determine the target descent rate for that visual descent angle. You do this using the FAA's climb and descent table, which we'll look at here in just a second. Then you need to calculate your derived decision altitude, or DDA. Again, this is very easy. All you do is take the MDA for the approach and add 50 feet. Then you need to calculate descent cross-check points to know how high you should be at certain mileages away from the runway. Then as you fly the approach, you need to adjust your descent rate as needed based on your altitude at those cross-check points. Let's take a look at how this is going to work on this specific approach. So again, step number 1, finding the visual descent angle is pretty easy. I'm looking for this little angle symbol here and the numbers with the degree mark. So our descent angle on this approach is going to be 3.05 degrees. And then it also tells us that our threshold crossing height, or how high we should be above the threshold, above the ground, or above the touchdown zone elevation, is going to be 45 feet if we stay on this visual descent angle from the final approach fix all the way to where we cross the threshold. So if I stay on this visual descent angle correctly, I'll be 45 feet above the runway when I get to the runway threshold. And that's going to come into play a little bit more here in just a second. Next thing we need to do is determine our targeted descent rate. For this, we want to use the FAA's climb and descent table. This is in the front of every TERPS publication that they put out. It's also available on programs like 4Flight, or you can just Google it to get a copy and get a screenshot, or for that matter, you can just take a screenshot of this video to see it here. You can see it gives us how many feet you should be above the runway threshold for every nautical mile you are away from that runway threshold for a given vertical path angle. So at 3 degrees, you're going to be 318 feet above the runway for every mile you are away from the runway. At a 3.1 degree angle, it's going to be a little steeper. You'll be 329 feet above the runway for every mile you are above the runway, and that'll come into play here in just a second as we determine our cross-check points. For now, what we want to see is if we are at a certain ground speed, what rate of descent is it going to take to stay on this visual descent angle. So what we need to do here is we're flying at 70 knots, so we're going to have to take halfway between 60 and 90 knots, and then we're flying a 3.05 glide slope, or glide path, or glide angle. So we want to take the average between 3 degrees and 3.1 degrees. And so basically what we're going to do is this is our descent rate at 60 knots at a 3 degree angle, at 90 knots at a 3 degree angle, and then at 60 knots at a 3.1 degree angle, and 90 knots at a 3.1 degree angle. So what I want to do is average all 4 of these numbers, add them up, and divide by 4. And that gives me a targeted descent rate of 405 feet per minute. Again, this is a little bit of a wag because we're using 75 knots and not 70 knots, but it does get us in the ballpark to give us an idea of what our descent rate needs to be when we hit that final approach fix to stay on this glide angle. And we do need to adjust this, if we have a significant headwind or tailwind and our ground speed is going to be significantly different than our indicated airspeed, or if you're flying at a higher elevation field, we do need to account for that. But this gets us in the ballpark for, a basically sea level field with 0 wind as to what kind of descent rate that we need to use. The next thing we need to do is calculate our DDA. Again, this is very simple. All we do is add 50 feet to our MDA. Our MDA for this approach is 600 feet. So 600 feet plus 50 feet is 650. So our DDA for this approach is 650 feet. And again, this just gives us a little bit of buffer to make that time, or to take that time to decide if we need to go missed approach or not, to take a look and see if we see the runway without going below our MDA. Next, we need to calculate our descent cross-check points. This is where we calculate what altitude the aircraft should be at above the threshold crossing height, or the TCH, for each mile we are away from the runway from the threshold back to the final approach fix. Again, earlier we said for a 3-degree vertical path angle, we should be 318 feet above the threshold crossing height for every mile we are away from the runway. And at a 3.1 degree angle, we should be 329 feet above the runway for every mile we are away from the runway. So if we average those two out, we have a 3.05 degree angle, so that comes up to be 324 feet above the threshold crossing height for every mile we are away from the runway. So if we do the math on that, that means we need to be, at the runway threshold, we should be at that threshold crossing height of 45 feet. At 1 mile away from the runway, we should be at 324 feet above the threshold crossing height. We add another 324 feet for the next mile, so 648 feet above the threshold crossing height. Again, add another 324 feet, so at 3 miles we should be 972 feet above the threshold crossing height. And then at 4 miles we should be at 1296 above the threshold crossing height. And at 5 miles we should be 1620 feet above the threshold crossing height. This tells us how high we should be above the threshold crossing height, but what's more helpful to us is to know what our altimeters should say at each of these checkpoints. So let's see how we figure that out. So again, I know my threshold crossing height is 45 feet above the runway or the touchdown zone elevation. If I stay on the path, that's how high I should be above the runway as I cross over it. And I know that my touchdown zone elevation is 222 feet. So once I am setting down on the runway, my altimeter should read 222 feet. So if I should be 4,500 feet or 45 feet above this altitude as I cross the threshold, that means I should be at 267 feet on my altimeter as I cross the threshold. Now we'll work our way back. So at 1 mile away from the runway, I need to be 324 feet higher based on that descent angle, higher than that 267 feet. So my altimeter should read 591 feet. This is below my DDA, so at this point I should have the runway in sight. If I work my way backwards at 2 miles, I should be another 324 feet higher than the threshold crossing altitude, so 648 feet total, plus that 267 feet means my altimeter should read 915 feet at 2 miles. At 3 miles, it should read 1239. At 4 miles, it should read about 1563. And at 5 miles, it should read about 1887, which makes sense because at 5.1 miles, or at my final approach fix, I should be at 1900 feet. So I won't have had much room to get down by the time I get to 5 miles. As we go through the approach, again, we'll fly into Hinox, descend down to 1900, configure, get ready to descend at Geese. And when we get to Geese, it will sequence directly to the runway 09 threshold, or this runway 09 waypoint, which will tell us exactly how far we are away from the runway in miles and tenths of miles as we fly that final approach segment. So as I come up to each of these mile points, I'll start my descent at Geese, and then I'm going to cross-check at each of these points. So as I get to 5 miles, I'll take a look at my altimeter, and then I'll see how close I am to this 1887. If I'm significantly high, that means that I need to adjust my descent rate to have a steeper descent. I need a higher rate of descent to get back on that vertical angle. At 4 miles, or if I am significantly low, that means I'm descending too quickly and I need to shallow out that descent or reduce my descent rate to get back on that angle. I'll check it again at 4 miles and see how high I am or where I am referenced to 1563 feet. Am I above it? Am I below it? And make an adjustment from there. And then I'll keep checking all the way down basically to the DDA. I'll do a check at 2 miles, and then when I get to 1 mile, I'm going to be inside my DDA. So at that point, I should have seen the runway and be able to continue to a visual landing from that point. So that is how we do the CDFA technique. Let's talk about specifics on how we're going to fly this with this aircraft. So again, we'll fly the procedure to Hinox, then descend down to 1900 feet. And then once we get about 3 miles from Geese, or 3.0 from Geese on our GPS, we'll begin to configure for the descent on the final approach segment. So we'll want to bring our power back to 1800 RPMs. When we're less than 110 knots, which should be immediately, we'll go ahead and bring our flaps to 10 degrees. We will hold our altitude and allow the aircraft to slow. When it gets below 85 knots, then bring the flaps to 30 degrees incrementally, one notch at a time. Then around 75 knots, you'll want to bring the power back in so that you maintain level flight at 1900 feet at 70 knots in the landing configuration, and that should be about 2200 to 2400 RPM. Once we hit Geese intersection, we want to go ahead and initiate that 400 foot per minute descent. I would recommend using autopilot, but you can do it manually if you would like to. We'll reduce our power to about 18 to 2000 RPM. That should be enough to maintain our 70 knots in our landing configuration in that 400 foot per minute descent. We will start cross-checking our altitude with our descent cross-check points and then adjust that descent rate as needed to stay on that path. We will track the lateral guidance with small changes in heading or allow the autopilot to track the lateral guidance for us. And then we'll transition to a visual landing once the required visual cues are in sight, or execute the missed approach when we get to that DDA. I do want to mention that it is a legal technique to fly your targeted descent rate to your DDA and then level at your DDA and fly forward to the missed approach point. If you don't pick up the runway at your DDA, sometimes with these LNAV approaches, you can have higher MDAs, and you may not be close enough to the runway in terms of miles away from the runway that if the visibility is at minimums, you would be able to pick the runway up at that distance. So you can level and fly forward. Just be aware that if you do that, first of all, don't forget to bring your power in so you don't slow down and stall. And second, be aware that the further away you get from where you leveled, the more likely it is that you're going to be too high to make a safe descent from your DDA down to the runway. You may have an excessive rate of descent. So even though you pick the runway up at a closer point, you may still have to go missed approach because you just can't make it down from that altitude that close to the runway. All right, so we'll start our setup for the flight from the world map as usual, and as usual, we'll start to the top left and work our way to the right. As far as the aircraft goes, we want the Cessna 172 Skyhawk, not the Skyhawk G1000. The Arista Blue is just a third-party livery that I have loaded up, so you will not see that unless you have that livery loaded yourself. Liveries, it doesn't really matter what you pick there. Weight and balance, I go ahead and go with 2 full tanks and 2 170-pound passengers in the front. No failures, and then customization, whatever you'd like to do there. And then the airport we'll depart from will be Kilo Papa Bravo Foxtrot. That is Pine Bluff Regional Airport, Grider, Pine Bluff. And you can either start on runway 36 if you'd like, or you can start on the ramp. I will choose to start on the ramp, but you can start on the runway if you'd like to do that as well. As far as flight conditions, I will select a mid-June day and we'll set the time to noon for lighting conditions like we usually do, and I will set the time down here in the bottom left-hand corner, again about noon, and that will give us good lighting, and then we'll set the weather in the session. And with that, we are ready to go ahead and get into the session and start setting up in there. So as far as the weather setup goes, we do have our altitude calculations set up at AMSL, so you don't have a sloping cloud cover as the terrain elevation changes. Precipitation, you probably do want at 0. You don't want any additional restrictions to visibility. No snow depth unless you're feeling like you really need that kind of decorative effect. No lightning unless you want some excitement. And then temperature at about 60 degrees, which is about standard there, and then the pressure at standard 2992, and humidity at 1, which is the lowest value. Again, if you put it any higher, you're going to get a restriction on visibility that may prevent you from getting in. And then as far as the cloud cover, we'll just adjust this bottom layer. I've got it set to 100% coverage, a density of 0.5, which should give us about that 1 mile visibility. Scatter, it really doesn't matter what you do with it, but I've got it set to 0. Altitude top, I've got it set up around 11,000 feet, which should give us a nice thick cloud cover that we won't break out. And then the bottoms I have set up at negative 350, which is about 1,000 feet under our DDA, which is about where you need to set it to break out at DDA. So that's how we have the weather set up. Let's go ahead and hop in the aircraft and show you how we'll set up the avionics. All right, so the very first thing that we want to do once the GPS gets all booted up is to roll the big cursor knob all the way over to the right to get it to the aux page, the aux pages, and then roll the little cursor knob all the way to the 4th page where we get SBAS selection, and then push the middle of the small knob to get that cursor active, then hit enter. And we want to go up to the WASP since we're in the United States. This is the SBAS system for the United States. And in order to get this approach to work properly or not have a glide slope, we need to roll the small cursor knob and then roll it up to off and then hit enter. And so now our SBAS system is turned off. So I'll push the cursor to get back out of this, push it twice, and roll back over to the number 1 nav page, and now we'll start loading our flight plan and procedure. So after I loaded or turned off the SBAS, I went in and put a airport-to-airport flight plan. You don't have to do this, but there is a glitch in the GNS 530 that was introduced after the last SIM update. It may have been corrected with a world update, but I have not checked yet, that the off flag would stay up if you loaded just using the procedure page or by going direct to Stuttgart with no flight plan. And if you enter a flight plan in there, that takes care of that so that it does not do that. So if you want that off flag to not display, then do that. Otherwise, you can just load going direct to Stuttgart and then loading the procedure, or just loading the procedure from the procedure page. The CDI will still work regardless of what you do. It'll just have that annoying off flag that for realism, kind of kills the realism for some people. Okay, so to actually load the approach, what I want to go to do is hit the procedure key in the bottom right here. It's already highlighted select approach, so I'll hit enter. And then you can see I've got the list of approaches here that's already pulled up. It does say Stuttgart Airport there. And I'll scroll down to the RNAV to runway 9. That's what I want, so I will hit enter. It asks me how do you want to enter that approach, and I want to go from Riddick, so I'll use the big knob to scroll down to Riddick. There that is. Hit enter, and then it asks me load or activate. Load puts it at the end of a flight plan. Activate sends me directly to the first fix on the approach, and that's what I want to do. So I'm going to scroll down to activate and hit enter, and we can see it's loaded everything up now. So we've got Riddick, Hinnox, Geese, runway 9, climb out to 600 feet on the missed approach, and then go to WGAV and hold. So all of that does look correct. I can put the cursor in there to scroll down and see it should have the hold there at WGAV, so we're good there. So the flight plan is correct. Everything looks good. And so we'll go ahead and get out of that, and we'll set up the other things that we need to set up here. I'm going to put the 430 on nav page 1. I'm going to put the 530 on nav page 1. The only other thing I really need to set up right now is my autopilot. I'll go ahead and bring the altitude pre-select to 3,000 feet. I already have my runway heading of 360 put in there. So that's all good. So I believe we are ready to go ahead and call and get our clearance. All right, so Pine Bluff does have a clearance delivery frequency that we can contact Little Rock approach on the ground. So we call them up and say we're looking for our IFR clearance to Stuttgart. They call back and they say Cessna 172 Alpha Hotel cleared to Stuttgart as filed. On departure, fly runway heading, climb and maintain 3000. Departure frequency is 119.85, squawk 5502. We read that all back. They likely call back with either a clearance void time or tell us to call at the end of the runway to get our IFR release, which is probably a little more likely. And so we'll do all that. We'll get our squawk code in there, and then we'll taxi out, do our run up, and get our IFR clearance and make our departure. We'll perform a normal takeoff from runway 36. Again, we need to climb to 400 feet AGL or 606 feet on the altimeter before we can make any turns. So as we get it on the autopilot, climbing out of the traffic pattern and get it stabilized in the climb, we'll go ahead and call up Little Rock departure. They call back and say Cessna 172 Alpha Hotel, radar contact, climb maintain 3000, proceed direct to Riddock. We read that back, and then we'll go ahead and start navigating towards Riddock. We do have 3000 in the autopilot already. I'll go ahead and turn to my desired track of about 017, so over here around 01517, and then I'll go ahead and redirect to Riddock. It has it up there already. Hit the direct key. It has Riddock in there already. I'll press enter, and then I'll activate, and our course centers up, and I'll go ahead and engage nav. Nav is tracking, and we are tracking towards our first waypoint on the approach. I'm going to go ahead and bring the zoom out to about 35 miles so I can see the whole approach out there, and then we'll climb up to 3,000 feet, level off, and then cruise out, and then we will get ready for the approach. So as we get within about 10 miles of Riddock, we are handed off to a different sector of Little Rock approach. We contact them and they say, Cessna 172 Alpha Hotel, you are 10 miles from Riddock, descend and maintain 2,500. Maintain 2,500 until established on the approach. You're cleared for the RNAV-GPS to runway 9. We read back that clearance, and then we'll go ahead and descend down to 2,500. So I'll roll my altitude pre-selector down to 2,500 feet, toggle into the vertical speed mode, do it a vertical speed at about 500 feet per minute. I'll adjust my power to keep at about 110 knots as I descend, and now we are authorized. We've been given clearance for the approach, and we're authorized to use all the procedure altitudes on the approach. So when we get to Riddock, we can go ahead and descend to 2,000 feet. Once we get to Hinox, we can descend to 1,900 feet. And then once we get to Geese, we'll configure about 3 prior and then descend, as we talked about earlier, down to our derived decision altitude, or DDA. I'll also mention I've got the zoom out here, zoomed out to about 20 miles here, and you can see that the runway 9 waypoint is in there inside the screen, so I know I'm at least 20 miles from that runway 09 waypoint, which is the basis for my MSA. It says as long as I'm within 25 nautical miles of that waypoint, then I will be safe at 2,500 feet. Again, MSA is not a procedure altitude. We need clearance to go down to that altitude, but you know in Flight Simulator that you're not going to hit anything. Also going to go ahead and adjust my OBS to 090. My GPS is sending me a message reminding me to do that. Again, moving the OBS is not going to change the way anything works. It's just a reminder of your course. It actually wants you to change this to whatever your current desired track is. So right now it wants 020, then up here it's going to want 360, and then it's going to want a 090. Again, it doesn't make any difference. If you want to change it every leg, that's fine. But you know, if you just want to set it to your final approach course as a reminder of what your final approach course is, that's fine as well. It's not going to affect the way the CDI works in any way. As I'm approaching Riddock, I'll go ahead and reset my altitude pre-select down to 2,000 feet. Then I'm just waiting for the GPS to cross Riddock, and then I can go ahead and descend down to 2,000 feet, which is the procedure altitude on this segment. It pops up and tells me I've got about 7 seconds left. Gives me a countdown from 10 seconds to the fix. And now it says 0. We'll wait and make sure we've got distance to okay, we're going Riddock to Hinox, so we can go ahead and descend. I'll go ahead and put in a vertical speed of about 500 feet per minute again. Reduce my power to keep on the speed of about 110 knots of indicated as I descend. And then we'll level off, and then we'll get to Hinox, and we can turn on the intermediate segment and descend down to 1,900 feet. So now I'm approaching Hinox. I'm going to go ahead and dial my altitude pre-select down to 1,900 feet for this segment here. It started the turn. It hasn't sequenced to the next waypoint yet. We're looking for it to say Hinox to Geese, and then we can go on down. Still have our distance counting down to, there we go. Now we're Hinox to Geese. We'll go ahead and start that descent. I'm just going to do about a 300 foot per minute descent. Won't take us long to cover 100 feet at that rate. You'll notice that the LNAV is also enunciated here, telling us it's now in the approach mode. So that is a requirement that we have that before we can shoot the approach. If we didn't get that, we would want to discontinue the approach. And we're level at 1,900 feet. We're waiting for 3 miles from geese, and then we'll go ahead and configure and get ready to descend on the final approach segment. All right, so there's 3 miles from geese. We'll go ahead and start configuring. We'll bring that power back to about 1,800 RPM. We're below 110 knots, so we'll get that first notch of flaps out. We're waiting for 85 knots to get the rest of the flaps out. So we'll hold the altitude, allow the aircraft to slow. There's 85 right there, so we'll bring that second notch of flaps out. There's 80, we'll bring the third notch of flaps out. 75, I'm going to go and bring my power back in to about 2,200 to 2,400 RPMs. It seems like 23 has been working out pretty good. And then the goal is to maintain level flight at our approach speed of 70 knots. I'm going to go ahead and dial in my altitude pre-select. I'm going to dial it down to my MDA of 600 feet. That way it won't try to level up prior to that. You do not ever want to set it below your MDA. So if my MDA was 601, I would want to set that at 700 feet. Since my DDA is 650, some people would probably advocate for setting it at 700 feet anyway. That is a valid technique as well. That's the technique that's used by a lot of professional flight departments, is to take your DDA and then round up to the next 100 feet if you can only do 100 increments in your autopilot, which is common. And we'll go ahead and get the landing checklist complete. At this point, we would probably get handed off to the Common Traffic Advisory Frequency and start making our traffic calls at Stuttgart. So we'll go ahead and do that. And we're just waiting for the flip from Hinox to geese to the runway final approach, or the missed approach point. And once we do that, we can go ahead and start our descent. All right, so it started the countdown here, coming up on our final approach fix. As soon as I see runway 9, I'll go ahead and toggle in that 400 foot per minute descent. I'll adjust my power 18 to 2,000 RPMs to keep it on 70 knots as we descend, and we'll start cross-checking. So 4.8 miles right now. We missed that 5-mile point, so we'll check it again at 5 miles. At 5 miles, I'm looking for an altitude of 1887. Excuse me, I'm looking for an altitude. 4 miles, I'm looking for an altitude of 1563. So we'll see how we're doing at that point. A little slow, so I'll bring some power back in here. Bring my view out here so I can. All right, so there is 4 nautical miles. I'm exactly at 1,600 feet. That's only about 40 feet high. I am happy with that. So I'm going to keep my 400 foot per minute descent in there. Bring the power back just a little bit. I'm just a smidge on the fast side right now. I'm going to check again at 3 nautical miles, and I should be about 1239. 3.5, we're coming up on 1,400 feet. There's 3.1. 3.0, and I'm at about 1280. So I'm, again, only about 40 feet high. I'm pretty happy with that. I don't want to make any big adjustments right now. Next checkpoint is going to be 2 nautical miles. I should be at about 9:15. And then it'll be time when I get down to about 7:50, I'm going to take a look outside and start looking for the runway. 2.5 miles coming up on 1,100 feet. Crossing through 1,000 at 2.1 miles and 980. So just a smidge on the high side at that point. So we're doing very well on tracking our descent angle. So I'm going to keep that 400 foot per minute descent coming, and then when I get to about 750 feet, we'll take a look outside. I've got about 100 feet to get the runway in sight. All right, so there is 750. Let's take a look up. Nothing yet. And there's the runway at 12 o'clock. There's 700 feet. 50 feet to go to my DDA. I'll go ahead and get the autopilot off, and I'll transition to a visual landing. There's no VASI or PAPI on this runway, so I'm just going to have to eyeball it as far as my glide path to the runway. But we've got the runway in sight. We'll proceed to a visual landing. So that is how you fly an old school GPS approach with no vertical guidance. So to determine when you can consider yourself proficient at these approaches, you want to use the Airman Certification Standards for the instrument rating. It is Area of Operations 6, which is instrument approaches, Task A, which is non-precision approaches, which this approach is considered a non-precision approach. Prior to the final approach fix, it's just like any other instrument approach. You're expected to be able to maintain your altitude plus or minus 100 feet, maintain your heading plus or minus 10 degrees, maintain your airspeed plus or minus 10 knots, and then accurately track radials, courses, and bearings, which means you should never go to full-scale deflection, although in real life, you probably get some judgment from the examiner if you were significantly off track anywhere close to full scale. So that is the limit for the check ride. As far as the final approach fix to the missed approach point or the visual descent point, the standards there are that you establish and maintain a stabilized descent once you hit the final approach fix down to the derived decision altitude or DDA. That you allow no more than a 3/4 scale deflection of the lateral course guidance. This is the same as when we fly precision approaches or approaches with vertical guidance. And then maintain your airspeed plus or minus 10 knots, your approach speed plus or minus 10 knots as you descend. And descend to your MDA plus or minus 100 feet, or excuse me, plus 100 feet minus 0 feet. You are given 0 foot tolerance to go below the MDA. They don't want to see you go even 1 foot below the MDA, which is why we calculate a DDA to give ourselves a buffer between our MDA and where we're actually going to make the decision to go missed approach. Then they expect you to transition to a visual approach using a normal rate of descent and normally maneuvering if they tell you that you have the field in sight, or to execute the missed approach procedure when it's appropriate, either when you arrive at your DDA and you do not have a visual, or anytime you deem it's appropriate prior to that. That concludes this video. Hopefully it's given you the knowledge and skills you need to fly GPS approaches without vertical guidance on your own. As always, if you've enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, share with your friends, subscribe to the channel, and ring the notification bell to be alerted to new content. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.